What effect did the war have on the economy that ultimately led to this?
I think it was actually like a way to to stabilize the economy after a period of income inequality and like jobs insecurity and a bad economy, like the depression and all of that. So these were things that were put into place to counter that, to create like a much more stable economy. And people needed work. So there was like a lot of like job work programs during that time.
Yeah, I was gonna, how did they how did they create more work for people? The government specifically.
Buildings, you know, like one of the reasons to even create like housing, like public housing, was to like actually get people to work. So there was different ways, like where they were figuring out like how can you stimulate the economy through, you know, whether it's construction or you know, increasing manufacturing. Like California, for example, got a lot of the defense contracts. So there was also the Cold War happening after the war, and we like LA thrived from a lot of like the defense contracts. And actually, one of the communities that got the most benefit from that was the African American, like the Black community here in LA, and also got hurt the most when all these kind of factories that were providing these jobs left. And that's kind of the multiple, like one of the things that happens kind of 1970s onward that brings us to the way the work looks today.
And why did the factories leave?
So there's like a couple of different factors. You know, like the thing about the golden age, was that it definitely in some ways like had a lot more equality in terms of like where people were, and there was definitely like people had more access. And I think, you know, there was different visions in terms of like what we want that economy to look like. So like kind of three main things happen, and there's this labor historian named Ruth Milkman, and she calls it the 3Ds. So the first thing was deunionization, so weakening labor power. And you see that up until today. Like back then, about a third of the workforce was unionized. Sometimes in some places even more. That's down to about like 7 to 8% in the private sector, and maybe like
right
10
now.
in yeah. So pretty much decimate that. And what the unions did, if nothing else, like if you have capital and you're the big company, you have all the power. Like you can make all the decisions about what happens at that workplace. What unions did is that they somewhat balanced that. They can come in, they've got collectivity, they've got multiple voices. They can take the one thing you need more than everything else, which is labor, and use that as a negotiating tool to advocate for better conditions. So that was the unions. The kind of employer business company side, like you don't want to negotiate if you don't have to. So let's weaken this side. Then the other part that was also kind of neutralizing the dynamic was government regulation. So the second D is the deregulation.
And you're saying these are things that incentivize factories to move elsewhere.
No, this is that it'll do that. It was the kind of like what changed from like the 70s onward, and the factories moving onward was the third kind of dynamic. Like the second thing was deregulation, which was to take the jobs that were here and like, you know, suddenly like there's this fear, and you see it a lot in the current administration where like as if regulation is a bad thing. Like regulating trucks so they don't pollute the air is gonna hurt the trucking business. You know, regulating, we hear it a lot around the coal. Like we need to free them up so that, you know, business can thrive, versus thinking about how the regulation actually helps manage what could be, you know, and you saw that in the like 2008, the 2008 crash is like what happens when you don't regulate. And, you know, capital kind of goes wild. And then the third one was deindustrialization. So to me, like that is the race to the bottom. Like where can we get the cheapest wages and the cheapest the cheapest labor. And a lot of companies, because again, labor is your biggest cost. And so you're constantly thinking about like what are the different ways that I can cut it? And it was those three things, where with deindustrialization, like a lot of the manufacturing, it turned out it was much cheaper to go to other countries.
Right.
And so a lot of the firms left. Some stayed. There's still a small percent, and it's still a part of our economy. But, it went from, again, like a third of the jobs to like, less than 10% now.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. So what I get from that is saying that unionizing and regulation actually incentivizes companies to leave?
No, it's 3 tracks, all which, it's almost like they happened together in order to take that kind of golden age that had kind of the least in income inequality and break it down and break it apart. So you do them together. So like the jobs that you could move abroad, you moved abroad. Or you could replace, the whole thing around like AI, like taking away jobs.
Yeah.
They were doing it before. Like I think the new stats have come out that like for manufacturing jobs, there was just as much, if not more, jobs replaced by technology as much as the ones that went abroad. So it's all about cutting your labor costs. So like that was the first one. So that's for like kind of the industrial manufacturing world.
Right.
Then for the jobs that remain, like let's change the conditions of that, So now there's not as much government regulation around the jobs themselves, so that there was much more space for exploitation. There's not as much worker power, because even when unions, like are going to negotiate, they're working with a lot less, authority, because they don't have as much of a backing from the workforce.
Which kind of just happened, right? Wasn't there just a recent ruling that took away some power from the unions just last week?
Yeah. There's something called the right to work, which has already kind of taken over a lot of southern states and took over like Wisconsin a couple of years ago. And the idea is if you choose not to join the union, you will still pay a fee in order to pay for the cost of the fact that the union actually negotiated the terms of your work. And so the whole kind of thing around like why in that particular case that was like violating First Amendment rights, which was like a very strange like ruling to say that violates First Amendment.
Is that what they ruled? That's what it was?
Ruled. Yeah. But the thing is that it's coming out of this larger movement called Right to Work, where they've already passed it state by state. So, that kind of push of the progressive policies versus the regressive policies, a bunch of states already had done this, which was, again, like, it's a way to defund unions. It's a way to reduce the power again. It's a way to, like, take away the value of what they provide. And it's just another step, because we're talking about 40 years of doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
I've always been curious about the unions. So we recently had a teacher on a few episodes ago. We were talking about the teachers' unions, and we were kind of wondering about what about those that are in that industry but don't want to be a part of the union.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the unions need a lot of reform, and that like there's unions that like have had to face their own challenges in the terms of the way that they're representing. To me, though, they are still the last vested, like the last kind of front line that's really out there to defend working class people in some kind of real way, like that have still, at least to some degree, some money and resources to push for policies that support working families. And like I feel like there's kind of narratives out there that like they're just bad, there's like some like historical pieces that people kind of dip into, but my thing is like change it. Like you don't have to lose it, because I think advocating for yourself and solo, which is what the messaging is, like if you go get a job at like a lot of times these big box now, they have you watch a movie where they'll say, don't join the union if anyone tries to approach you, to join a union or organize, because deal directly with your manager and your manager will be in your best interest. That's assuming that that there's some kind of level playing ground in that negotiation. And now companies have these things where they'll have you sign arbitration, like that you will not go join a class action. You will, use mediations, and you'll use their mediation services. So I think that there's this idea that like solo and individual is better than collective. And I think that like if there's issues in the union, like be in the union, be a worker voice, push back, both internally and externally, but don't give up on it.
Because I've wondered about that too, because I know that a lot of unions, they're also involved in causes and issues outside of the direct industry. And so I wonder, I'm like, how does that work for as a member? Because say you join a union, teacher, whatever it is, teachers union, for the benefits of them fighting for you as a teacher. But then, how does that work if you don't agree with them going out for this cause or that cause? Like, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the minimum wage, the Fight for 15 campaign was started by a union. And it actually wasn't going to impact union members.
What do you mean?
Because union members have contracts that negotiates their wages. So they're good.
Oh, interesting.
They're good with their wages. Right. And if they need changes and they need to get it raised, they go through their collective bargaining process. And, to me, it was a leap for the unions to say, like, we're going to fight not just for our members, because that's also a critique that it's gotten too narrow, that you only care about, like, one specific slither of work, versus looking at it more broadly is like let's think about this as like an issue for like let's raise the floor for all the workers. And a lot of them, might be immigrant workers. They might be potentially new union members, and like think about us like more broadly. And for me, like that was like a very bold move for them to do, even if it's like, putting resources that's, beyond like just the workforce, just their direct workforce. And I actually think it's important for unions to start thinking that way, and us thinking about ourselves more collectively, versus like my interest or, my, and like just kind of challenging that a little bit more.
What do you think this ruling is going to have on unions now?
They're going to have to work harder.
Because that's essentially where they get all of their funding from, right? Is the members' dues.
Yes. So like unions have known this was going to come. They've been experiencing this attack for decades, and I think this is why they're investing in kind of broader policy issues, thinking about workers in a more collective way. I don't think it's taking away resources from their own membership to do that. I think it's a way of like starting to think about what are some new workforces that we could think about bringing into the union. What is like a shared collectivity that can happen if this workforce or that
like
workforce
merging
comes
unions
in.
Kind of
Not even unions, like merging, like bringing in folks that are not unionized, like
bringing in new industries,
thinking about workforces out there that that unions haven't been there or haven't kind of fully done that. And I think this is what that ruling is going to do. Like it's they're already doing it, like I see them out there, they're organizing in new spaces, they're thinking about like, how to engage, there's the teachers unions. And like one thing, like the teachers unions has always been very solid. You take like say at the college level, you take like if you go and look who are kind of the folks teaching the classes right now, it's adjunct professors, adjunct lecturers. Adjunct? So the adjuncts, there's the people who are the tenure track. They've got the job. They're good. They're there for they're full-time professors. Adjunct is someone like, I'm going to pay you $3,000 or $4,000, and you're just going to teach a class. And so much of you're seeing more and more universities moving to that model
because it's cheaper.
Exactly, and it's just another example of like how can you disinvest from that long-term commitment to your staff and bring in, these kind of like one-offs. And, that one-off person could be teaching for years. And so, there's a workforce that could be potentially unionized because it's growing. It's a sector. They've become extremely marginalized in the broader system of lecturers. Like they have no power, and yet they are delivering kind of like significant resources to the university. They're not being invested in. So thinking about that, like both in terms of, what's the new world of precarious work?
Why would the adjunct professors take advantage of that, of taking on that position, if it's not to their benefit?
Because it's the only job available to them. It's harder and harder to get that full-time tenured position. And so you do it because it's what you get.
Why is it harder to get a tenured full-time position?
I think there's not enough. I think that, like, for every full-time position that opens up, there's like 100 people lined up to take it. So, open up more full-time, long-term invested tenure positions, or hire those other 9 people that were lined up to take that job.
Is there
for
a
half
demand
the
for
cost, or like you could, because the work is there, but the position is not, right? Because all these folks are adjuncting, which means that they've got the work, but you're not investing in them as employees. You're bringing them on as temporary.
Sure. So maybe take on less adjunct professors and
Build more
full-time
positions. Sure.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the critiques I've heard over possibly raising the minimum wage, or I think this was something with Obamacare. You probably know, lowering the number of full-time from like 40 to 30 or something like that. I heard that one of the effects of that was that people were starting to hire less workers and just taking a few more and making those full-time. And then that was causing the unemployment to go up, or causing people to lose their jobs. Is that true?
There are very contradictory studies about what happens when you raise the minimum wage. So that is the counter argument. So every time any place tries to raise the minimum wage, you often have businesses saying that, and you often have this thing like, if you raise the minimum wage, I'm going to cut staff. I'm going to cut hours. Like, I'll pay more, but I'm going to give them less hours.
Right.
And that was the thing around Obamacare as well. There are also counter studies that say you can raise the minimum wage, and it has a catalyst event in the economy, which means you have more money in your pocket, and which means you're going to spend more money at the shops, which means they're going to get more money because there's more people spending money. So it's not like you don't see it directly.
And then they're going to hire more because
then you have
money.
more business, so you're going to hire more. And then the wage, actually, they say that it doesn't just raise it for the folks who make minimum wage, because as their wages go up, the person above them also has to go up, because you have to kind of keep, the different ranges. And honestly, like, the studies say both. I'm always like, if the studies, like one study, especially folks who don't want the minimum wage raised, are like, it destroys jobs. And at the same time, other studies will will work with very similar data sets and show that it increases, like, over the long term, it can increase work. It doesn't, there might be some job loss, but it's not like apocalyptical, and then, like, I'm like, the benefits are much, like, the benefits are people are making more, like, do we really want to counter that? And if you look at, like, our minimum wage has gone up a couple of times, and our economy is the best ever in like 2 decades right now, and our unemployment is the lowest in a real, like in I'm like, how many decades? But in a while.
And you think that's directly connected with the minimum wage and these regulations?
If the minimum wage, again, if the counter minimum wage argument was like people are going to lose jobs, that's not totally what happened. So it's because we're in this is probably, like, this round was the largest minimum wage increase, like, in multiple places. So we'll see a lot of research coming out of it. But I'm like everybody deserves an increase. And why would you keep the minimum wage the same for a decade? Like that, like it doesn't make sense when our cost of living, especially in places in LA where like everything is too expensive now.
Well, I've heard that too, that the minimum wage actually contributes to inflation. Does it? That it causes employers to raise their prices to be able to cover the minimum wage?
Yeah. So that's another, like, again, like on the counter argument side, that they will raise their prices. I've like also like read that it doesn't end up being, like it ends up being minor enough that it doesn't hurt folks. And again, there's still a stimulus happening at the same time. I'm also sometimes we're talking about, like, there was this one study that looked at like those like workers along the food chain, and they basically were like, if you raise the wages, it would be 10 cents a day for you. Like, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about like, oh my gosh, suddenly you're going to be paying, even dollars more. So there might be some job loss, there might be some like prices raised, but not like, I don't think like I wouldn't think like the whole economy is going to experience inflation versus like, how many years ago, like you would pay $2 for a coffee and now you'll pay $5. Like people absorb costs. And for me to absorb that cost because the person who's making it gets to earn a little bit more, like, let's do it. Why not,
Yeah, I think some people think, I'm guessing their argument is probably more for those really small businesses, I would guess. But
that's the other thing, is that a lot of minimum wage workers don't work. It's not the small businesses, that like a good portion of like fast food and retail and restaurants it's a lot more corporations now.
Oh, really?
And it's funny because a lot of the lobbying comes from the corporations, and then they get this mom and pop person, to come up and like kind of be the face of the story. But most of, I'm totally about supporting the mom and pop shops, and even the minimum wage was trying to give them like a little bit more time on the increase. But when we're really talking about who's earning minimum wage, we're talking about companies.
How did they come up with the $15?
Honestly, I think it was like it sounded good.
It sounded good.
Like a fight for 15. It sounds great. And it's kind of like organizing. You pick something that's going to be like your goal, but you realize it's probably, I think it was like at that time the minimum wage was like $9 or $10. So like, oh, why don't we say 15? This is totally me conjecturing because I wasn't in the room when the campaign kind of started. But to me, it was like, at the time, it seemed very ambitious that there's no way there's going to be a $5, like that big of a leap. And it was really beautiful to see that, like, what probably was like, you set a really high goal and then you realize, because you have to negotiate along the way, that actually won.
Yeah, because that's another thing I've heard people wonder is I mean, why 15? Why not 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, in reality, why not 20 or 30? Because a minimum wage is not a livable wage. So most minimum wage workers, I mean, they're working 2 jobs. We're talking about like 2 jobs, 3 jobs. We're talking about a lot of parents. We're talking about 2 income earners where both parents or both, like income earners are working multiple jobs and minimum wage jobs. So like people like should think about the minimum wage, not like, oh my God, why did we give them like so much money? Like you barely equalized what's really needed to survive in this city.
What do you think about the critiques that some people say minimum wage jobs aren't supposed to be full-time jobs to support a family?
I mean, like that would be great if there was livable wage jobs. But a lot of times, like folks, that's the kind of work you're getting. And, like who's doing that work? It's often like exploited, marginalized, like, communities who are often left out of the better paying jobs too. My thing is like, why not make those jobs good jobs? Why not pay them more? You know, like there's often like a dismissing of like, you know, a restaurant job worker has like no skills. And I was like, there's a lot of skills you need to work in a restaurant and manage the like chaos of a kitchen. So why don't we think about compensating them more? So mine is more like thinking about like, why do we think some jobs aren't worth being paid for? Not so much like that job shouldn't sustain the family. It's like, if the person wants to work in a restaurant, that's great. Why don't we make the restaurant job a sustainable one for a family?
Well, and I also wanted to ask about that too. Because there's certain groups of people that I know you guys want to support in this. Like you were just saying that there's certain groups of people that tend to be in these jobs that are exploited. Why is it that there's certain groups of people that tend to be in these jobs more than others?
It's a lot about options and access. You see, when you kind of get to like some of the kind of like the lowest paying jobs, you get the folks who have probably least access in the economy. And for a while, like one of the reasons why LA thrived is completely on the contributions, like the work contributions of like undocumented folks. And because you had folks who didn't have legal status, you had folks that you could not pay minimum wage. So forget about paying minimum wage, like not even paying minimum wage. And so the jobs, you know, they're created in that way where like, you know, you take folks who wouldn't have other options in other parts of the economy. For us, it's not just, you know, it's not just immigrant or undocumented workers. Like we did a study on young workers and they're in very similar kind of conditions of these kind of like low wage service sector jobs. And there's a whole kind of a whole kind of framework around that where like, well, you're young, like you should work that crappy job because it's your first. And our thing is like, well, you know, like back in the 70s, like, yes, you did this thing where you delivered the paper, or, you know, you developed some bones until you like went to college, which was affordable and graduated. Yeah. Versus today where like young people are working, you know, they're in school longer, you know, they're staying in these service sector jobs longer. And it's not, you know, it's not dismissible and it's not, you know, as like the workers aren't as, we shouldn't think of them as disposable and turnover versus the fact that folks are staying in these industries for much longer and that they are becoming, you know, they're needed for like families, you know, to sustain themselves, even if that's not what the minimum wage was built for. The minimum wage was built for the babysitter. Like pay her minimum wage. It's good because, you know, you're living home and you're living with your parents and you don't have any costs. But why is it that like, you know, we have, you know, families living on minimum wage jobs, or you have young people who are trying to like pay for college and like, you know, being in minimum wage jobs.
What do you think about the idea of essentially the free market concept that companies, if say there was no minimum wage, would have to compete for better services by competing for wages, and that minimum wage has maybe stagnated that competition because now everyone's kind of on the same level. Do you think there's something to that?
I think that there's nothing wrong with building a floor. Like you can still have competition and build a floor.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.